Thank you for your time, everyone. This is dynamic components and concepts office hour for the month of October. I'm Mustafa Casey. I'm the product manager for dynamic components. Along with me, my manager, John Brock, are here to present the dynamic components and answer your questions. We are recording the meeting, as you see, and please post your questions on the QA panel, not on the chat panel. And as I'm speaking, John will try to answer as many questions as possible. And if there are more questions that, it's more dynamic component specific, and then I will try to answer them after the meeting and during the live session. If I don't have some of those questions in my knowledge, I will try to get them and get back to you. So further ado, let's get started. So let me try to first talk about the use cases that makes up dynamic components. So as application developers, we develop user interfaces, pages, and various components within those pages. And most of those pages require quite extensive coding, and sometimes the content is also a dynamic in nature. And so user interfaces that require changing dynamically, dynamic components would allow customization, having those content come to your pages dynamic way, a declarative way, rather than you all developing and writing, voluminous, complex application code. And as application developers create pages, those pages are edit pages, does perform various operations. You customize those pages based on conditions. Those conditions are runtime conditions, rules, and etc. Dynamic components allow you to declaratively, again, make those changes appear on your page, and execute on those on your pages, rather than manually writing, code. I guess low code or no code concepts is essentially what the industry calls. Dynamic components are already being used by the Fusion applications, Fusion Cloud applications. Our Fusion Cloud teams are leveraging dynamic components in their next gen, in their migration of developing Fusion applications using Visual Builder Studio. Visual Builder Studio allows customers to achieve a high degree of customization with low code, as I said. And one more concept is the quick start. I'm sure some of you are familiar with the quick start capability in the Visual Builder Studio design time. And that also applies to dynamic components for table data, for form data, whether create form, edit form, or details form. And so if I'm developing a dynamic form-based application, quick start will allow me to, define and create all the under the cover plumbings that you need for the for your work, your job done. Editors, rule sets, templates, and fields are also as part of the Visual Builder design time experience. So how do I get dynamic components? The good news is dynamic components is already there in Visual Builder. You don't have to do any installation or configurations, if you will. And it's part of the Visual Builder starting 2107. And so when you install dynamic component or allow dynamic component for your applications, there are three flavors of it. A dynamic container essentially segregates your page per sections. Sometimes you want to define your pages in sections that serves a specific purpose. Dynamic table, as the name implies, it's gets your table in a tabular manner, and leverages under the cover OJ component, OJ table jet component. And dynamic form is the dynamic form, is a form that you want to be able to input some data and update some data essentially. And under the cover, it leverages OJ form layout as the jet component. There are supporting components with dynamic components like field binding and section binding. You don't really directly interact with them. Nevertheless, they're there to serve a specific purpose for the dynamic component framework. As I mentioned, dynamic components available in Visual Builder Studio. And as you progress in your application development, dynamic components we update and we release new versions, latest versions, and they can be from the component section in Visual Builder. You can look for them, and then essentially you can install them, or update to that particular version. Look for dynamic UI pack. It will get you everything that you need for that. So let's dive into maybe a high-level component architecture. I put this sort of a diagram to help you sort of understand the moving parts. This is only for dynamic form specifically, but the concepts applies to dynamic table as well. So on the right side, let's take a look at as an employee form, whether it's a read form or an input form, if you will. And it's got an employee name, last name, a drop down for a country, state, and then region that country it belongs to. On the left side, there are two main concepts of dynamic components, which I will be mentioning this and repeating throughout the presentation: metadata source and data source. So dynamic form consumes metadata from the metadata source. That metadata source is a Swagger, or a JSON. You can have two flavors to it, and the variable from the data source that makes up your backend service. And between the two, dynamic form establishes a relationship, if you will, and stamps each defined metadata with a particular JET component and appears on your HTML page. So if you have in the metadata, you have a text field, and that could be input text, and dynamic form automatically stamps that as an input text and appears as employee name, which is the input text. Let's just go fast forward to a drop down. If your metadata is defined as a multiple, single value or a lookup value, LOV type of thing, then that could be as a select single in JET world, and that's also appear as a drop down, as you see, as a country. Similarly in the state. In region, that's an input text, but notice that's kind of grayed out, and that's read-only or updatable, which I'll speak to you about that later in the presentation. So bottom line, we have two main regions, main concepts is a metadata source and data source. And if you even look at the API documentation for the dynamic form or dynamic table, you'll see value and metadata is always appear in every API, in a dynamic form API as well as dynamic table API. And so those are important concepts to keep that in mind. And you look at the JSON file that it's created as a result of this, again, so you're going to see the variable section and metadata section that makes up your dynamic form real estate, if you will. So most important piece of the dynamic component is the client ways, right? So if you want to develop dynamic components by design, the dynamic components fetches the metadata from backend service, and that metadata is OpenAPI 3.0 Swagger specification. So keep that in mind. It's OpenAPI 3.0 Swagger specification. In certain situations, for example, your service is not OpenAPI 3.0 Swagger for whatever reason, then that doesn't mean anything. You can develop your own custom JSON file, right? You can construct that JSON to mimic your backend service, and we call this base client metadata. To keep that term is important. Base client metadata. Everything I'm talking to you on this slide is client metadata features. It's essentially what you can do above and beyond that base service, base metadata service. So base client metadata, if your API doesn't support OpenAPI describe, right? And then you can use base client metadata feature. It's an option to develop that JSON file. And once you develop the JSON file, then you can place that JSON file into certain locations in your application structure, and then dynamic component can read it and then understand it and then transform and does the job like I just explained on the architectural diagram. So there are two sections in the base metadata. The JSON file is the $common and $operations. $common defines certain common properties like metadata type, like a file path, and operation ID, file path. You know, you're creating that JSON file. What is the path for that? Where are you going to put that in your application directory and things like operations? What kind of operations does your service support? You know, so you need to also speak about, is it get, is it only get but not update, and things like that. So that's important, so that dynamic component can understand what operations it doesn't need. And so that's one thing. The other one is the augmentation. You know, so that's as the name implies. What do I have to do above and beyond, you know, that base metadata that I just talked about? I can add fields. You know, if I want to add new fields, so why would I do that? You know, and most of the time, you know, application developers want to create virtual fields. That's like the augmentation of two fields, first name, last name, and I want that to call name, right? You know, so that's called virtual field, and it's in a runtime thing. You know, so in your data service, you do not have a field called a name, but in the runtime, in dynamic component can combine those field, first name, last name, and makes up a field called virtual field. That's one example. Another one is a calculated field. Sometimes you want to have some calculations and to create as a field on the runtime, you know, and so that's also is another option for add field operation in the client metadata augmentation. Is another one is add metadata. You want to be able to you know, define certain metadata such as validations. Validators are important concepts in dynamic component, and you know, and so that's also is a important, you know, to do some metadata augmentation. And default values. You know, so you just before your application starts up, you want to set up certain default values for your certain fields, and that's also is example of add metadata. Again, there are some other examples of client augmentation. It is the extension, right? You know, so I talked about in the first use cases is the Fusion Cloud applications extend, customize their base application, Fusion applications using Visual Builder and dynamic components, and which we call that extension support. You know, and as I am, you know, if I'm doing a base application, and then I'm also extending the existing cloud application using extension support. So for that, there is also has to have some metadata that we need to use, and that's called application extension. You know, so that's an important concept that you need to be familiar with, you know, when you're developing dynamic components, because you might need to customize and extend your base Fusion application, and that's called application extension. So metadata follows the same structure. You know, nothing changes. You know, we're not giving you a different structure because it's a base application versus a base application extension. And so in the application extension, it's still that same structure, same syntax. The one thing though, it's the cumulative from the metadata that obtained from the base application and added onto the client side. You know, so it's the cumulative, you know, that makes up the application extension. Another thing is that when you're defining application extension, you have to also, you know, speak about the add field, talk about the add metadata, which I talked about it. So add field, the key here is that there's add field is if it's the same field used in the base application as well as in the application extension, there's going to be collision. And so you have to keep that in mind. This is mentioned in our API reference documentation, and you're going to get some runtime exceptions, runtime errors, you know, so that's also is something that you have to be cognizant about it. Add metadata. So operations add metadata is to add metadata properties that already exist in the base metadata. For example, it contains a map that maps target of the operation, either $common or $operation ID to the content that will be added. So that's the add metadata piece. And replace metadata. So you have a metadata coming in the base application, and so, but you want to be able to set the visibility, or you don't want to set the visibility in application extension, depending on your use cases. And so you can use replace metadata to make changes. There was a use case, a couple of weeks ago, of one of the team wanted to essentially make a change on one of the attribute that came from the base service, the backend service on the runtime, and they wanted to use the client augmentation as replace metadata to make a change, because otherwise the business logic was breaking, for example. And so that's another example of changing the metadata on the fly, which is I think a great use case. Both expression, the support that for the things that I mentioned to you, application extension and the base application, etc. We also have expression support. So expression supports applies to both client metadata as well as base metadata, and these expression support can go into the file structure as augmentation as well. I have some examples I think that I can show you later on in the presentation, as well as on my demo. So one of the things that most important part of dynamic component is the layout. As I'm developing my service, my application, I have a service and a service associated with a business object, and that business object associated with the layout. Layout will have rules, layout will have a set of fields, and layout could have templates. So those are the high-level concepts that you speak when you're talking about dynamic layouts. And so as the dynamic layouts comes in, when the application runs, all those fields are being rendered, and the order of the fields and how they're rendered and what are the concepts that those fields are rendered is all part of the layout and defined in the layout. In Visual Builder design time, the dynamic container layout is contained within the page metadata, while dynamic form and dynamic table, it is contained in the dynamic layouts module. So those are two things you have to keep that in mind. So though the location of these layouts stored differently, okay, but the content, for dynamic container versus dynamic form and tables are exactly the same. So you don't have to, keep doing a context switch between the layouts, because the syntax and the content will be exactly the same, which is good. You don't have to, keep learning different things for different layouts. So here's a quick snippet of the layout look like. So there's always a layout. This is the page JSON file that you will see most of the time. Always, I should say. The name of the default of the layout name. You can always give a specific name, and it's the default, so that is always the starting layout for you, and the layout type. So in this case, it says form, but that's dynamic form. And if it's a table, it's going to say table, for example, and the direction and the maximum columns and label edge, label width, etc. are essential defining that layout. But remember, we talked about all dynamic form concepts are being stamped as a JET component. And I said dynamic form is under the cover OJ form layout, and that's that information used for that, so I have a direction means a row, and then I have two columns that is going to make, so I'm going to have two fields, side by side, but it's going to be, one after another. It's a row structure, and label width. And what about the properties that display for the fields in this layout? And that is shown here, first name, last name, employee ID, hire date, and etc. So I'm defining these in my layout for that particular object. So hopefully this makes sense to you all. And context variable. So I'm moving from dynamic layout to context now, right? I'm trying to do this logically. As I'm moving through my application, developing my application, I need pieces of information in certain pieces of my application and certain places, and etc. And place is important as well. So context variable, most importantly, exposes various pieces of information to application developers while you're developing your applications. Believe me, you're going to always need a context variables when you're developing your applications. So you need context variables in evaluating expressions within the metadata of the dynamic layouts inside the layout.json file or the layout-x JSON file, which is augmentation, remember, or within your within your templates, within your form templates or field templates. So I will share the API reference with you later on. And the API reference is going to have quite a bit of a section on the context variables and what they are, what we support, and deprecated ones, and so in rules that you want to use those context variables it's in our API reference documentation. So some examples on the context variable. Field metadata is one important context variable. So that is essentially says, I want to reference a metadata for a particular field. In this case, field is description, right? So I have a metadata service, a Swagger service for my service, and there is a description field. I want to be able to access that in my application. Field metadata is used for that. Read only. It's an important attribute, property, I should say. So corresponds to the read-only property, for your service and for the particular attribute. And so you use that to essentially make some fields visible or invisible, or make do certain business rules based on that. So read-only is used for that, and there are certain other context variables that is defined in Visual Builder. That's not defined. These are not defined with for dynamic components, but we can support them. Let me put it that way. And so those are given some examples here, and you have to refer to Visual Builder documentation for those, but we have a section in our API in context section that we can refer to the link for you to get there. So some more examples of context. Let's fill this slide. So the first one is the context variable used in the rule. So remember I talked about layout, and layout has a rule section. Here is saying that expression is saying that employee ID greater than 2000. I want you to use alternate layout. Okay, so you can have many layouts that defines your business service, right? And based on the business rules of each layout, you can do certain functionalities. In this case, if employee ID is, let's say, greater than 2000, I know it doesn't make sense, but just for an example purpose, you want to use an alternate layout. In the file, you're going to have layout that it's going to have alternate as the layout name. So it's going to, dynamic form is going to essentially run that in the runtime, or default if it's less than 2000. So that expression is a great example of what you can do with the context variable. The point here is you want to use $value dot employee ID. Remember, $value is the data that pieces of data comes from your data, and then in that data there will be an attribute called employee ID, and that's where this is going to drive from that. A second example here, context variable can be used to determine the display properties of a dynamic layout. That's very interesting. So in this example, remember I talked about Visual Builder context variables. One of them was $responsive, right? And so here, if I am saying my screen layout or screen size is small, okay, and it's basically, this is saying if the responsive.sm only is true, then employee ID and email are not displayed. If it is false, displayed, right? That's really what this is saying. But the bottom line is that I can access the $responsive as a context variable in this example. right? So again, employee ID emails are not displayed if the responsive.sm only, which is the screen size is small. If not, I can display them, right? Because you don't want to, you want to basically work through your real estate of your pages, for example. So now moving from context, so we started with layouts and then context. Now I'm going to move into another concept in dynamic components, which is the global field templates. So before I can talk about the, I speak about the global field templates, what is a field template? Let me speak about that. So a field template basically contains UI, user interface components, for example, text fields or images. It defines their properties, such as styling details. So components in a template can access the variables, constants, action chains, event listeners defined in the layout. So as I'm developing my base application, I might define a default template for a field, which is applied to every field in my layout, or for that particular field in every layout, right? Let me say that back. You know, in a base application, I might define a default template for a field, which is then applied to the field in every layout. So you can overwrite this default template if you want to define your own template. Instead of defining a same template and mapping in each business object, right? Because I have to define a template for a given business object and I have to keep reusing it over and over again. We introduced a concept called global field template, which is essentially you define a template once per application across different business objects. So that's reusability of a field template, which is, we call it global field template. One caveat is that global field templates are available in OJ dynamic form VDOM version, you know, virtual DOM version of the dynamic form. You know, VDOM is a concept we introduced, you know, for JET, and we do support that in the dynamic form. And so global field templates only available for VDOM version of dynamic form, which is OJ-dyne-form. You know, so if you go in Visual Builder to download or to install a dynamic form, and you'll see two flavors of it: is the VDOM version and non-VDOM version, or the CCA version, if you will. So one more thing about the global field templates is that I keep talking about same format, same syntax, which is a good thing, right? So we have the same format of a field template, whether it's a field template or global field templates, and which is used either in the base application or application extensions. So use the same format, the same syntax. Okay. So this quick snippet of how you define a template and use it in your base application. There are certain properties, like here you see a layout discriminant and a few others. For those details, I would like you to refer to the API reference for more information on it, on the field template metadata properties used in global field templates. And the context support. You know, please note, again, global field templates do have context support, and just like anywhere else, you know, we did not neglect to use context support for global field templates. We make it available even there, and file locations for base application as well as extensions, the application extensions. So for that details, for the interest of time, you know, I'm going to skip it, but API reference will have it. It has a section on this. Read-only and required. So fields in dynamic components can be configured read-only rendering, and whether values are required, quote unquote, updatable rendering. So read-only and required properties can be configured in several ways. So let me try to explain what those are. The first way is whatever your backend service defines. In this case, I have a quick example of it from a Fusion application account object, a Swagger file sample. It's only showing party ID, as you see here, and pay attention to read-only attribute, and it says true. Right? Of course, in my Visual Builder application, I shouldn't be updating party ID, right? Because that's coming from the backend, and therefore it's defined as read-only true. So that's an example of Swagger or JSON base definition of read-only. But you can define read-only or required in other places where client augmentation metadata. I talked about add metadata, in replace metadata, things like that. Remember, in a couple of slides back. So that's a place where you can define the read-only or required. Layout files is another place that you can define read-only and required. And finally, in the instance level, in the component instance level, in field templates, you can also define read-only and required. So there are several places that you can work with read-only and required, which gives you that flexibility that we've been talking about for dynamic components. It's not only one place. So read-only and required, I said, you can define in a Swagger, and then you define in a client augmentation, and then layout, and then instance level, right? So the path is, or the decision path, I guess, or the flow path is start from Swagger, it goes to client augmentation, layout, and then finally in field template. But as I'm doing this, there are certain rules that you need to be careful, right? Those rules are there to sort of enforce the data integrity and the business decision and business rules as much as possible. Because we're saying, well, I'm going to start with my business service, and I'm using that as my yardstick, my guiding principle, as my my gold data, piece of information that is I need to make sure I am respectful to the data there, the metadata, I mean. So if this means that if the base metadata has a property set to true, then the client augmentation, client metadata augmentation, and the layout cannot change that property to false. Okay. It also means that if these properties were originally false in the base metadata coming from my backend service, okay, then false in my base metadata, and it's set to true in client metadata augmentation, it cannot be changed to false at the layout level. Okay, so once something is set to true, you cannot change back to false in the lower level. All right, and so the Boolean value can be static or dynamic as a result of an expression. So read-only properties in layouts indicates that field is read-only. Required properties in the layout indicates that field is required. So please pay attention to these rules as you're developing your applications, read-only and required rules. One more thing that I wanted to, in this last bullet. So this is for dynamic table, if you will. Oh, by the way, read-only required, it applies to both dynamic form and dynamic table. I forgot to mention that, but it applies to there. So some services supports response that has a body, right? Get, for example, get response, get REST service will return a body. Am I right? And so such as that default read only is true. So we expect that default read only be true. But some operations that don't have a response body, such as put, post, or patch, we say default read only is false. That's our guiding, that's our documentation, that's our product. That's how we started this implementation. That's how it's there. So just keep those in mind as you're working with read-only and required. So I finished the read-only part. Now the final is the server metadata features. So client metadata features is what I can do in the client side, above and beyond what server side is telling me, my base side is telling me. But there are certain use cases that I want to also modify, do some changes on the server metadata, right? In REST endpoints, so I mentioned this REST endpoints, there's REST services that, defines my backend service, follows OpenAPI 3.0 specification. And dynamic component, component that I'm speaking, transforms OpenAPI 3.0 documentation to its metadata. I think you pretty much know what that is, right? Variables and metadata and layout.json file, etc., right? So you seem to be picturing it in your head. Some of the metadata have its own corresponding equivalents in OpenAPI. Some of the metadata is derived from multiple properties and sort of kind of augmented. And we do this under the cover. You don't have to do any piece of code, quote unquote, declarative way, if you will, and which is why I've been talking about low code or no code. And some of the metadata are derived as extensions to the OpenAPI 3.0 specification. By the way, those 3 points that I mentioned in our API reference documentation, it's got sections on what those are, and so please, again, and note those, and it will be really important to keep those in mind. So our API documentation, I said, outlines properties present in the metadata. So those are high level. Here is the component type, converter that, if you want to convert certain aspects of it, data provider, which I'm going to talk about in the next slide, and default value, read only, and descriptions, and there are many more in our API documentation. So let me fill this up. So I keep talking and repeating this REST API endpoint being Open API 3.0 specification. And if you look at a sample REST Swagger file, you're going to see some attributes being a dynamic choice list or fixed choice list, if those terms something familiar to you, and LOVs, if you will. We do support them. We have to support them. That's our, starting principle of designing forms and tables, right? Because parent object has got relationship to child objects as well as relationship to other parent objects, right? As you're working with Fusion applications. So the attributes in business services can have, like I said, a dynamic choice list or a static choice list as LOVs. And those LOVs are expose them as X-LOV, right? So if you look at, so let me just go to an example, maybe easier. So it is an example of that. And so this is an example of state by country LOV, right? So in this case, this is an X-LOV, and X-LOV means actual. When you look at the Swagger file, you're going to see X-LOV. And when I am defining my layout, I said, okay, I'm going to use accounts object, and accounts object is going to have account service, REST service, and that's going to be a Swagger file. Swagger file is going to have X-link, X-LOV, and that's going to be links. And dynamic component documentation, that's the metadata for dynamic component, okay? Not API documentation, maybe that's confusing, is going to say, okay, for a state field, I'm going to say that particular attribute as a data provider, and I'm giving you details. So this data provider, and curly brace it, and all the way to the end is what a dynamic component does to represent that state variable, the LOV variable. Again, this is under the cover. As you're defining the layout, it's going to do that for you. So data provider is a keyword. You should keep that in mind. And is what makes the field an LOV field. You know, sometimes people ask me, so I have an LOV field in my service. How do I get that in dynamic layout? You don't need to do anything, you know, and dynamic layout is going to recognize that. But if your Swagger doesn't way of exposing it or giving, dynamic component is not going to do anything. You know, your dynamic component is good, but it's not that good, right? So your service has to really define that. And so that's what dynamic provider component does for LOVs. So just to close with learn more, right? Jet API documentation. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the API documentation. Visual Builder Cookbook is also a great sample place to look for all the samples that you can use and get to learn. Blogs.oracle.com/VBCS is the Visual Builder Cloud Service blogs. And I put the Oracle University Learning subscription. So I found this to be very useful, very hands-on, and free for customers to register themselves through the learning subscription to learn Visual Builder and developing visual application using Oracle Visual Builder. Maybe most of you are also familiar with it. Cloud Customer Connect forums, Visual Builder Studio, and the API reference. I'm going to show you how to get to this. And finally, a Visual Builder group on LinkedIn. You know, it's another great way to be notified any updates on Visual Builder Studio and all the components and etc. So demo, it's really a quick demo. It's not that detailed, but I hope to cover as much as possible. So it demonstrates a sort of dynamic component specific to dynamic form capability in a real world example. What is that? As an HR representative, and I want to be able to access employee information in my organization. You know, if I want to display basic information about the employee, and then with a click action, I want to display drill down into details about that employee and the connection between the two. You know, so let me just stop sharing and go to. So before I do that, maybe let me just change my and my presentation and prepare my. Okay, now, apologies, bear with me. Okay, share screen. Desktop 3. All right, so get out of the way. Let me just go in here. Let me walk you through this Visual Builder Studio design time, and let me just move on here. So on the components palette, I've already selected the components from the. So let me just. So I have installed the dynamic UI pack. I don't know, install is maybe a strong word, but I essentially search for it and install the word. But dynamic Visual Builder says, okay, here you go, you can use it now. You know, so essentially there, container, remember the form binding, section binding, form, and table, right? Those are my three major components on dynamic component. And there's a simple page. Page has got, a grid. Grid is a grid item. You know, it's basically allows you to build flexible layouts and defines OJ flex, as you see here, defines sizes of my screen, etc. Right? So that's just to get the plumbing going. I have the heading, so heading here, bind text. So I have defined variables, dollar page dot variables. And so where are they? Let me just go in here. By the way, everything's are here, right? So I think most of you are familiar with this. So I'm, stop me. So I have variables here, button label, expanded state, form header, etc. So one of the variables is the form header, so essentially here, that's what I'm using it for. I'm going to load it as I'm running my application. And then it gets to my dynamic form. So let me click on that. Custom context, form layout. Form layout, I called it form layout, but you can, obviously in your real-time application, you're going to use it more carefully selected names for your layouts, right? And so this is my dynamic form. Why? It says that, it says dynamic form, and ID is defined and selected by, by the as you're defining it, and the rules rules is actually another way of saying this is my layout. Remember, applications have layouts, and each layout defined for a given business object, business service. In this case, I have an employee service, and that's layout based on that. And I've selected certain fields, and I have a button, and that is going to essentially move between detailed view and simplified view, or basic view, I should say. Let me run it and quickly to show you. And so I'm running this on the actual Visual Builder, Studio, not previewing it, just for the interest of time. And so I have the employee's name here. This is a read-only view per se. So if I click on the detail view, it takes me to detail view, right? Click on the basic view, it'll take me to, basic view, right? It's really simple. And now let me show you how I did this. So if I click on the rule, click on the go to rule set. So I have two layouts. Remember, I talked about be able to define context variable in every section of your application development. It's in your metadata. It could be in your layout. In this case, it's in my layout, right? What is that context variable? Component context. That is, believe it or not, is a context variable. And so if you look at the API documentation and go to context section, and you're going to see component context, and it's going to talk to you about what it is. I talked to you about certain supportability of context variables, and this is the table I'm talking to you. So certain context variables are only supported in certain places. Maybe is a word. They're field template, form templates, and etc. So that's just another side knowledge. So let me just jump back here. So here it says component context expanded. If it's expanded, I want you to use expanded layout, which is right here. If it is not expanded, I want you to use default layout, which is right here. See these two layouts. I can create additional layouts here, and so I can move between the layouts based on my business rules. I can create additional rules as well. This gets to more Visual Builders Design Studio. So I just don't want to, take up your time for that. But essentially, this is what it's showing. So let me go back to my page. So that's why I'm moving between the pages or between the layouts. Now, what about the actions? How is this data coming? So if you click on the action tab here, I'm going to have basically two main, action chains. One of them is the button action chain, which is what is going to move me between the layout. And so simple if then statement, right? If page.variables expanded stays expanded, then I want you to set the status, so I have the expanded state variables. So let me just go to expanded state. It's going to say false, and the button label is going to say what? Now scroll down, sorry. Detail view, right? Right, because I want that to be detail view because it's expanded already. Am I correct? So that's detail view. So I want I'm sorry, this is going to be in my simple basic view, and the button label is going to say detail view. So when I click on the detail view button, it's going to bring me to the detail view. Really, that's what it is. And so if it's then in this case, the other way around means already been. So let me show you here. So this is basic view. So now I'm in a detail view, but button is showing me as basic view, correct? If I click on that, it's going to take me back to basic view. So that's what that is. And expanded state is going to be essentially true. Why? Because I'm in the true state there. I'm in the detail view, right? And so that's that. So that's the button action. And this is a good, interesting one. And by the way, when you drag and drop a dynamic form into your panel, into your application, whatever, some of the action chains that you see here is designed and created for you. You know, you will be like, whoa, how did all these action chains, actions came to my, you know, action chain? You know, so Visual Builder design time with the help of runtime, obviously dynamic component and Visual Builder, we work very closely, you know, so whatever I support in design, the dynamic components, I need to ensure that that's also supported and provide some functionality within the Visual Builder design time, because I am interacting, you know, in the Visual Builder design time, but under the cover, code is being, you know, either produced or fetched from dynamic component APIs with the runtime and etc. So it has to be a tight integration, if you will. You don't need to worry about it as an application user, but as a product owners, we do work with them, you know, side by side, and you know that's so important. So some of these actions that you see here is coming from that integration, right? You know, that's the close relationship there. So the important piece here is this call that I wanted to talk about. Why? Because this is the REST call, right? That's where the data is coming from. And so, and this is my endpoint, and this endpoint is defined in the in JSON file. So if I can show you that, just bear with me. So this is my HTML page, right? So if I click on the code, I'm going to see my HTML page. ID, metadata, layout, value. Remember I talked about value? That's being the variables, the data that come from for my data source. And so here it says get employee by ID. So get employee by ID is really a type, but type is referred to as that row of that employee data object, right? In a high level. And then value on loading and rendered fields. Those are some details, you know, that essentially improves the performance of my dynamic form, you know, and I'll let you, I leave it there, but, there's going to be a section on those in our reference documentation, you know, so FYI, you can take a look at them. And so this is the HTML page. What about the metadata that I've been talking about? This is the metadata. Well, this is the page JSON file or the JSON file. Here, everything you see in my HTML page, you know, page designer is being essentially created as a JSON file. Variables, you know, I talked about button label, get employee by ID. Remember I said that whenever I get the response from the employee object, REST response, I'm gonna save it as a employee response type, right? It says here, type, page get employee ID response. So that's a type object variable. You know, it's neat that it's obviously showing you the string. I mean, this is usual VB design time concept, nothing new here. And then, but the important part is the metadata piece here. That is a dynamic component concept, right? You know, so metadata of that particular resource that we are saying. In this case, we have the dynamic layout metadata provider descriptor. So that's our implementation of defining dynamic layout metadata and how that's going to come to the layout page. You know, so if you go into API documentation and go to interface to classes and search for dynamic layout metadata provider factory, and that's the factory that we have. You know, this is just you get to use it, but you can also use these classes within your action chains and your module functions as well. You know, so that is my class, and so metadata provider is a concrete class where you can use. One good important part is the method is to get metadata. So this will return the metadata for your metadata service, right? Because you're going to 9 out of 10, you want the metadata in the runtime because you're going to do something with it. And this is the call that you're making. As a matter of fact, in my application, I am making that, you know, so let me go back to right here. Sorry. Most of you, I think, familiar with the VB enter, you know, so that's not really a dynamic component concept. However, VB enter is where the first time the page has been rendered and prepared for user interaction. And that is an action chain that is coming to call, which is get form label. You know, so if I got to go action chain here, and so there is a function Let me go to that. So this function is essentially getting the provider. Well, how is it getting the provider? So if I go back to that, go to the action chain, notice input is a provider, right? So if I go to the mapped, metadata employees provider, right? So in my page .json, the JSON layout, and I have the metadata, and there's a provider. That's where that is coming from. So that's the provider details about my employee service. In your case, it's going to be service data provider, so it's going to be FA. In my case, it's a different type of a service, employee, etc. So that's the service provider, and let me go there. So I'm using that provider, and I'm making a get metadata, right? And then component metadata. So that's what the API comes into picture here. So it's get metadata and returning as a component metadata. What's a component metadata? It's the interface that it's a really an important part of dynamic component, which is the component metadata. It talks about all the details about what that metadata is. Essentially, remember I talked about component type, converter, data provider, etc. That's all that is there for you. So,
Mustafa, I just want to do a quick time check. We got about 2 minutes left.
Okay, yeah, I'm talking too much, but let me end here then, John, because I think that I covered the major parts of this application. I think everybody probably got the gist of it, So I'm of course available for follow-up questions and etc. So maybe I can stop sharing and then ask questions and answer questions if anybody has one.
If you have questions, if you could ask them in the Q&A, that would be fantastic. I know we've only got a couple of minutes left. There was one question earlier, which was simply, are you planning to do a demo? So we covered that. But so far, no other questions. But if you have some, feel free to just pop them up there in the Q&A panel. Okay, looks like no questions from anybody, Mustafa. Oh, looks like, what do we got here? Looks like a vast topic. More blogs on this would be helpful, is the comment. So we'll be working on that. That's one of the things I think that Mustafa is just getting started on all of this. It is a very complex topic, or can be. Thankfully, the DT and Visual Builder does make it a little bit easier. So maybe we'll have some extra topics down the road. And I know Shai wasn't able to get onto the panelist login today, but he has given talks in the past on how to use dynamic components within Visual Builder. So there's some recordings up there of that as well. If you want to look for those. But
yeah, that's correct, John. Shai has quite a bit recordings on this, and I believe that's in his BPCS blog that he has section to it.
Yeah. So hopefully that gets you guys an understanding of what's going on under the covers of what dynamic components can do, and why, when you hear that term, what the heck they actually are. And we look forward to bringing more of Mustafa's knowledge to you guys in the future. Cool. Any last words, Mustafa?
No, thank you so much for your time, everyone. I appreciate it. And please, sync up with me and follow up and customer connect. And for those who are external customers, internal ones, Slack, and I'll be happy to help you any way I can. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it. Thank you for your support, John.
Bye, everybody.